Bullies stripped her down laughing. She kicked the air out of them. The rain-soaked streets of Portland, Oregon, glistened under the early morning streetlights as 17-year-old Sloan Garrett took one last look at the modest house that had been her home for the past decade. Moving boxes sat stacked like cardboard monuments in the driveway, each one containing fragments of a life she was being forced to leave behind. Her father's job transfer had come with barely 2 weeks' notice, a corporate restructuring that demanded immediate relocation to the suburbs of Virginia, where Jefferson High School awaited like an imposing fortress of teenage social hierarchy. Sloan's mother, Patricia, bustled around the empty living room with characteristic nervous energy, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she supervised the last-minute packing. "Honey, make sure you have your medication and those vitamins Uncle Marcus recommended," she called out, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness she'd maintained throughout their hurried departure. "And don't forget your gear bag. I know how important your training is to you." The mention of her training made Sloan's stomach clench with a familiar mixture of pride and anxiety. For the past 6 years, ever since she'd turned 11 and her Uncle Marcus had first introduced her to the disciplined world of martial arts, she had spent every Tuesday and Thursday evening, plus Saturday mornings, at Tiger's Den Gym in downtown Portland. The converted warehouse space, with its worn wooden floors and the perpetual smell of sweat and determination, had become her second home. Uncle Marcus Garrett stood 6'4", with shoulders that seemed to span doorways, his presence commanding respect without ever demanding it. A former Navy SEAL who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to open his gym, he possessed the rare combination of lethal capability and gentle wisdom that made him the perfect teacher for his niece. His weathered face, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from an IED explosion in Kandahar, would light up with genuine pride every time Sloan mastered a new technique or demonstrated the kind of character he valued above all else. "Remember what I taught you about control, little warrior," Marcus had said during their final training session, his calloused hands adjusting her stance as she practiced a particularly challenging combination on the heavy bag. The nickname Little Warrior had started as a joke when she first began training, a scrawny 11-year-old who could barely throw a proper punch. But over the years, it had evolved into a term of endearment that carried real meaning. The gym had been her sanctuary during the tumultuous years of middle school and the early part of high school, a place where her small stature and quiet demeanor transformed into assets rather than liabilities. Under Marcus's patient guidance, she had learned Muay Thai, the art of 8 limbs, with its devastating elbow and knee strikes, as well as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where leverage and technique could overcome size and strength. But more importantly, she had absorbed the philosophical foundations that Marcus insisted were inseparable from the physical training. "True strength," he would repeat during their meditation sessions that concluded each training day, "isn't measured by how much damage you can inflict. It's measured by how much damage you can prevent. The strongest warriors are the ones who never have to prove their strength, because everyone around them feels safe in their presence." Those words echoed in Sloan's mind as she adjusted her oversized hoodie, a deliberate choice that concealed the lean muscle definition she had developed through years of rigorous training, and navigated the crowded hallways of Jefferson High School on her first Monday morning. The building itself was a testament to suburban affluence, with its gleaming floors, state-of-the-art technology in every classroom, and trophy cases that stretched for what seemed like miles, celebrating decades of athletic and academic achievements. At barely 5'2", with mousy brown hair that seemed determined to escape any attempt at styling, Sloan had perfected the art of invisibility during her first few weeks at this sprawling suburban institution. Her slight frame, combined with her preference for loose-fitting clothes and her habit of keeping her eyes downcast, created an impression of fragility that couldn't have been further from the truth. But invisibility, she had learned, was often the best defense in unfamiliar territory. The student body at Jefferson High moved through the corridors with the confidence that came from established social hierarchies and long-standing friendships. Groups clustered around lockers, their conversations punctuated by the kind of easy laughter that comes from shared history and mutual understanding. Sloan observed these interactions with the analytical eye her uncle had taught her to develop, noting the subtle power dynamics and unspoken rules that governed teenage society. Her schedule was carefully planned to minimize unnecessary social interaction. Advanced placement classes that attracted serious students, lunch periods spent in the library rather than the cafeteria's social minefield, and routes between classes that avoided the main gathering areas where the school's social elite held court. It was a strategy that had served her well for the first 3 months, allowing her to maintain acceptable grades while avoiding the attention that could lead to unwanted complications. The hallways of Jefferson High buzzed with the typical energy of a Tuesday morning in late September, lockers slamming shut with metallic finality and sneakers squeaking against polished floors that reflected the overhead fluorescent lighting. The scent of cleaning chemicals mixed with teenage cologne and the lingering aroma of breakfast from the school cafeteria created an olfactory landscape that was becoming increasingly familiar to Sloan. She kept her head down, clutching her worn canvas backpack closer to her chest as she made her way toward her chemistry class, navigating through clusters of students who barely registered her presence. The backpack itself was a relic from her Oregon days. Forest green canvas with leather straps that had been softened by years of use, decorated with patches from various national parks her family had visited during happier times. It contained not just her textbooks and school supplies, but also a small notebook where she recorded her observations about her new environment, a habit Marcus had encouraged as part of developing situational awareness. She had learned quickly that drawing attention at Jefferson meant becoming a target, and she already had enough problems adjusting to her new reality. The academic standards were higher than at her previous school, the social dynamics more complex and unforgiving. Teachers expected students to participate actively in class discussions, a requirement that forced her to speak up despite her preference for remaining unnoticed. The chemistry classroom was located in the science wing, a modern addition to the school that boasted laboratory equipment most colleges would envy. Sloan had grown to appreciate Dr. Henderson's teaching style, methodical, fact-based, and focused on understanding rather than memorization. The elderly professor, with his wild Einstein-like hair and bow ties that belonged to a different era, had a reputation for being demanding but fair, and his classes provided a refuge from the social complexities that plagued other parts of her school day. "Well, well, look what crawled out of the woodwork," came a familiar voice that made Sloan's stomach drop like a stone thrown into still water. Bryce Kellerman stepped directly into her path, his imposing 6-foot frame blocking her route to the science wing with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to getting his way. As the star quarterback of Jefferson's football team, Bryce commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the school's social ecosystem. His sandy blonde hair was styled with the kind of expensive products that caught the hallway lighting just right, and his letter jacket was worn like armor, its bright colors and array of patches announcing his status to anyone within visual range. The jacket itself told the story of athletic dominance that had defined Bryce's high school career. 3 years of varsity football, 2 state championship appearances, and individual records that had attracted attention from college scouts. But beyond the athletic achievements, the jacket represented something more fundamental. It was a symbol of belonging, of being part of Jefferson High's elite social structure that determined who mattered and who didn't. Behind him stood his loyal followers, a carefully curated entourage that had formed around his success like planets orbiting a star. Madison Pierce, whose perfectly manicured appearance and razor-sharp tongue made her the unofficial queen of the school's social hierarchy, examined her reflection in a compact mirror with the kind of attention most people reserved for important documents. Her blonde hair fell in waves that had required an hour of styling each morning, and her designer clothes carried price tags that exceeded most families' monthly budgets. Madison's influence extended far beyond her obvious physical appeal. She possessed an intuitive understanding of social dynamics that allowed her to identify weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. Her Instagram account boasted over 3,000 followers, a digital kingdom where she reigned supreme through carefully curated posts that showcased the lifestyle most Jefferson students could only dream of achieving. Tanner Brooks, a hulking offensive lineman whose intelligence seemed inversely proportional to his size, completed the trio with his imposing physical presence. Standing 6'5" and weighing close to 260 pounds, Tanner served as both bodyguard and enforcer for the group's more delicate social operations. His hands, which could bench press over 300 pounds, seemed comically oversized as he scrolled through his phone with the concentration of someone attempting brain surgery. The three of them together represented everything that Sloan had hoped to avoid at Jefferson High, the kind of predatory social dynamic that turned high school into a hunting ground where the weak became entertainment for the strong. She had encountered their type before, during her brief stint at a private school in Portland, where her father had enrolled her before deciding it was too expensive. But those bullies had seemed almost amateur compared to the sophisticated cruelty that Bryce, Madison, and Tanner had refined into an art form. "Going somewhere, Oregon?" Madison sneered, using the nickname they had assigned Sloan within days of her arrival, after somehow discovering her previous home state and deciding it represented everything they found inferior about non-Virginia residents. The way she pronounced it made it sound like a disease or character flaw. "Don't you know the hallways have a weight limit? I'd hate for the foundation to crack under all that mass." The cruel laughter that followed made Sloane's cheeks burn with embarrassment that felt like standing too close to a fire, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, studying the patterns in the polished floor tiles as if they contained secrets to the universe. What they didn't know, what no one at Jefferson High knew, was that beneath her oversized hoodie lay a physique that 6 years of intensive martial arts training had sculpted into something approaching lethal capability. Her uncle Marcus, during one of their countless philosophical discussions that followed intense training sessions, had explained the burden that came with such knowledge. "The moment you truly understand what you're capable of," he had said, while they sat in the gym's small office, surrounded by photos of former students who had gone on to military service and competitive fighting careers, "you become responsible for everyone around you. Your hands become weapons, your feet become weapons, your elbows and knees become weapons. With that knowledge comes the obligation to use them only when you have absolutely no other choice." Those words had become a mantra during the difficult early weeks at Jefferson, when every instinct screamed at her to respond to provocation with the kind of decisive action that would establish her position in the school's hierarchy. But Marcus's training had been as much about self-control as self-defense, and she had internalized his lessons about the true nature of strength to a degree that sometimes surprised even her. "Please, I just need to get to class," Sloan whispered, attempting to step around Bryce's imposing presence, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of students transitioning between classes. The words came out smaller than she had intended, carrying none of the authority she had been learning to project during her training sessions back home. But something about these three brought out a defensive response that seemed to shrink her back into the scared 11-year-old who had first walked into Tiger's Den gym, overwhelmed by the controlled violence and intense focus that surrounded her. "Did you hear something?" Bryce asked his companions mockingly, cupping his hand around his ear in an exaggerated gesture of listening. His voice carried the kind of theatrical quality that suggested he was performing for an audience beyond just his immediate friends. "I could have sworn I heard a mouse squeaking." The comparison to a mouse was particularly galling because it struck closer to home than Bryce could have known. During her early training days, when her technique was still developing and her confidence hadn't yet caught up with her physical capabilities, Marcus had often referred to her movements as mouse-like, quick and nervous, lacking the predatory grace that marked a true martial artist. It had taken years to develop the fluid, confident movement patterns that transformed defensive reactions into offensive opportunities. Tanner, ever eager to please his more popular friends and apparently incapable of original thought, reached out with one of his massive hands and flicked Sloane's backpack with enough force to send her stumbling forward. Her books scattered across the hallway floor like casualties of war, creating an obstacle course for passing students who stepped over them without a second glance, their attention focused on their own social dramas and academic responsibilities. The contents of her backpack told the story of a dedicated student trying to succeed in a challenging environment. Advanced chemistry textbooks with pages marked by countless hours of study, a well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird for her American literature class, color-coded folders containing meticulously organized notes, and the small leather-bound journal where she recorded her daily observations and reflections. A practice Marcus had encouraged as part of developing mental discipline. Some students stopped to watch the entertainment unfolding before them, their phones already out and recording with the reflexive response of a generation that documented everything. The potential for viral content was always present at Jefferson High, where social media presence often mattered more than academic achievement, and public humiliation had become a form of entertainment consumed and shared without thought for its impact on the victims. "Oops," Tanner said with exaggerated innocence, his massive frame casting a shadow over Sloan as she knelt to gather her scattered belongings. "Butterfingers." The comment was particularly ironic, coming from someone whose hands were large enough to palm a basketball, but apparently lacked the fine motor control required for basic human decency. His laugh was deep and rumbling, the kind of sound that seemed to emerge from somewhere near his boots rather than his throat. As Sloan knelt to gather her scattered belongings, her position on the floor making her feel even smaller and more vulnerable than usual, Madison deliberately stepped on one of her notebooks with the heel of her expensive designer boot. The notebook contained weeks of carefully organized chemistry notes, illustrated with diagrams that had taken hours to perfect, and Madison ground her heel into the cover with the kind of methodical cruelty that suggested she had done this before. The boot itself was probably worth more than Sloane's entire wardrobe. Italian leather with a designer label that most Jefferson students would recognize immediately. But more than the monetary value, it represented the casual way that Madison wielded her privilege as a weapon, destroying things that mattered to others simply because she could. "You know Oregon," Madison said, her voice carrying the kind of false sweetness that made even compliments sound like insults. "Maybe you should consider homeschooling. I hear it's perfect for people who can't handle real social interaction. You could learn at your own pace, in your own little safe space, without bothering anyone who actually belongs here." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of smile that appeared genuine to anyone not paying close attention, but Sloan could see the calculated malice behind Madison's perfectly applied makeup. It was the smile of a predator who had found wounded prey and was savoring the moment before delivering the killing blow. The crowd of onlookers grew larger as word spread through the hallways with the lightning speed that characterized teenage communication networks. Their whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter created a wall of judgment around Sloan that felt more suffocating than any physical barrier. She could feel dozens of eyes recording her humiliation, capturing images and video that would be shared across social media platforms before she even made it to her chemistry class. Some of the watchers appeared genuinely uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, their expressions showing the kind of moral conflict that arose when decent people found themselves complicit in cruelty through inaction. But discomfort wasn't enough to motivate intervention, and they remained silent observers to a ritual that had become depressingly common in the hallways of Jefferson High. Others seemed to find genuine entertainment in the spectacle, their expressions showing the kind of vicarious satisfaction that came from watching someone else endure what they feared might happen to them. It was a defensive mechanism that allowed them to feel secure in their own social positions by witnessing the destruction of someone even more vulnerable. She could feel her face burning with shame as she crawled on the floor, collecting her things while the three tormentors loomed over her like predators savoring their kill. The physical position, on her hands and knees, looking up at their imposing figures, felt like a metaphor for her entire experience at Jefferson High, where she existed at the mercy of those who possessed the social power to make her life either tolerable or miserable. The chemistry textbook had fallen open to a chapter on molecular bonds, and as she closed it, Sloan found herself thinking about the irony of studying how atoms connected to form stable structures while her own social bonds remained so fragile and temporary. The parallels between chemical interactions and social dynamics weren't lost on her. Both involved forces of attraction and repulsion. Both required the right conditions to form lasting connections, and both could be disrupted by the introduction of volatile elements. "That's enough," came a voice from the crowd, cutting through the cruel laughter like a blade through silk. The voice carried an authority that made everyone in the immediate vicinity turn toward its source, including the three tormentors who had been so focused on their entertainment that they hadn't noticed the changing dynamics of their audience. It was a voice that belonged to someone accustomed to being heard and respected, even in an environment where respect was often determined by athletic ability or social status rather than character. Sloan looked up to see Dallas Thompson approaching, his tall frame moving with easy confidence through the gathered students who seemed to part naturally before him. At 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean build that suggested both intelligence and athleticism, Dallas commanded a different kind of respect than Bryce, one built on intellectual achievement and moral authority rather than physical intimidation and social manipulation. As the editor of the school newspaper and captain of the debate team, Dallas had earned his position in Jefferson High's social hierarchy through demonstrated competence and genuine leadership rather than inherited privilege or athletic prowess. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he was too focused on more important things to worry about perfect styling, and his brown eyes held an intensity that made people take him seriously even when they disagreed with his positions. The school newspaper under Dallas's leadership had become something more than the typical collection of sports scores and cafeteria menu updates that characterized most high school publications. He had transformed it into a genuine voice for student concerns, publishing investigations into budget allocations, interviews with teachers and administrators about policy changes, and opinion pieces that challenged students to think more critically about the world around them. His approach to leadership was both direct and diplomatic, a combination that allowed him to navigate the complex political landscape of high school administration while maintaining credibility with his fellow students. Teachers respected his work ethic and integrity, administrators appreciated his professionalism, and students trusted him to represent their interests honestly, even when it might not be politically convenient. "What's your problem, Thompson?" Bryce stepped closer, using his slight height advantage and considerably greater bulk to try to intimidate the newcomer. His letter jacket seemed to expand with his chest as he puffed himself up like a territorial animal responding to a challenge. This doesn't concern you. The confrontation represented more than just a disagreement about the treatment of one student. It was a clash between two different philosophies of power and leadership that had been building tension throughout the school year. Bryce represented the traditional hierarchy where physical dominance and social connections determined status, while Dallas embodied an alternative model based on merit, character, and moral courage. "Actually, it does," Dallas replied calmly, standing to his full height and meeting Bryce's glare without flinching or backing down. His voice carried the kind of steady confidence that came from having faced hostile audiences in debate competitions and difficult interviews for his newspaper articles. "When I see three people ganging up on someone half their size, it concerns me plenty." The mathematical precision of his observation, noting the numerical disadvantage and size disparity, reflected the analytical mindset that made Dallas such an effective debater and journalist. He had a talent for reducing complex situations to their essential elements and presenting them in ways that exposed the fundamental unfairness or logic of a position. Madison rolled her eyes dramatically, her perfectly sculpted features arranged in an expression of theatrical exasperation that had been refined through countless hours of practice in front of her bedroom mirror. Oh, how sweet. The newspaper geek has found himself a girlfriend. Match made in loser heaven. Dursu, the comment was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, to embarrass both Dallas and Sloan by suggesting a romantic connection that would make them both targets for further harassment, to reinforce the social hierarchy by labeling them as losers, and to deflect attention from the original confrontation by changing the subject to something more personally damaging. The suggestion of romance was particularly calculated because it would force both of them to either deny the connection, which would seem defensive and potentially hurtful, or accept it and face the consequences of being labeled as a couple in Jefferson High's unforgiving social environment. It was the kind of sophisticated cruelty that Madison had perfected through years of practice. The comment hit its mark with devastating accuracy, and Sloan felt her humiliation deepen as she realized Dallas was now being targeted because of her. The knowledge that her presence had made him a victim of the same cruelty she endured daily created a guilt that felt heavier than her scattered textbooks. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, and never have to face any of these people again, to return to the anonymity that had at least provided protection from collateral damage to innocent bystanders. But as she watched Dallas stand his ground against the three bullies, refusing to be intimidated by their threats or embarrassed by their insinuations, something stirred inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt since leaving Portland and the supportive environment of Tiger's Den Gym. It was the feeling of being protected, of mattering enough to someone that they would risk their own social standing to defend her. The sensation was both foreign and familiar, reminiscent of the protective atmosphere Marcus had created in his gym, where students looked out for each other and success was measured by character rather than dominance. It suggested the possibility that Jefferson High might contain people worth knowing, relationships worth pursuing, despite the risks they might entail. "Come on," Dallas said quietly, placing a gentle hand on Sloan's shoulder with the kind of careful respect that suggested he understood the vulnerability of her position. "Let's get you to class." His touch was brief and appropriate, offering support without presumption, and his voice carried a kindness that made the contrast with her tormentors even more stark. The simple gesture of helping her gather her remaining books while treating her with basic human dignity felt revolutionary in an environment where such consideration seemed increasingly rare. As they walked away, Sloan could hear Madison's voice carrying down the hallway like a toxic cloud. "Run along, Oregon. Maybe next time you'll learn to stay out of our way." The words were meant to be the final punctuation on her humiliation, a parting shot designed to ensure that she understood her place in Jefferson High's social order. But walking beside Dallas, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the genuine concern in his manner, Sloan found that Madison's cruelty had lost some of its sting. The chemistry classroom provided temporary refuge from the social battlefield of Jefferson High's hallways, its sterile environment and focus on objective facts, offering a respite from the subjective cruelties of teenage social dynamics. Dr. Henderson stood at the front of the room, his wild white hair seeming to defy gravity as he sketched molecular structures on the whiteboard with the enthusiasm of someone who had never lost his fascination with the fundamental building blocks of reality. Today, we'll be exploring the concept of chemical bonds, Dr. Henderson announced, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that suggested he found genuine joy in sharing knowledge with his students. The forces that hold atoms together to create the complex molecules that make life possible. Sloan found herself drawn into the lesson despite her emotional turbulence, appreciating the way that chemistry provided clear rules and predictable outcomes. Unlike the chaotic social dynamics that governed most of her daily experience, chemical reactions followed logical patterns that could be understood and anticipated. There was comfort in knowing that hydrogen and oxygen would always combine in specific proportions to create water, regardless of social hierarchies or personal politics. But her mind kept wandering to the confrontation in the hallway and the unexpected intervention by Dallas Thompson. She found herself stealing glances at him as he sat 2 rows over, his attention focused intently on Dr. Henderson's explanation of covalent bonding. His notebook was covered with detailed diagrams and careful annotations, suggesting a level of academic engagement that matched her own. The sight of someone taking their education seriously was both refreshing and slightly unsettling in an environment where academic achievement often took a backseat to social positioning and athletic success. Dallas represented something she hadn't expected to find at Jefferson High, the possibility of intellectual connection and genuine friendship that transcended the superficial considerations that seemed to govern most student relationships. When the class ended, Dallas approached her desk with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he wasn't overthinking the social implications of their interaction. "Hey," he said simply, "I wanted to make sure you were okay after what happened out there." The question was straightforward and sincere, lacking the complex motivations that seemed to underlie most social interactions at Jefferson High. There was no agenda behind his concern, no attempt to leverage her vulnerability for his own benefit. It was simply one human being expressing genuine care for another, a concept that had become surprisingly rare in her experience. "I'm fine," Sloan replied automatically, then caught herself in the reflexive dishonesty that had become her default response to personal questions. "Actually, no, I'm not fine, but thank you for stepping in. You didn't have to do that." Dallas's expression showed a mixture of understanding and determination that suggested he had given considerable thought to the dynamics he had witnessed. "Yes, I did," he said firmly. "What they were doing wasn't okay, and pretending it's normal just makes it easier for them to keep doing it." His perspective reflected a moral clarity that Sloan found both admirable and slightly intimidating. It suggested a level of social courage that she wasn't sure she possessed, despite her physical training and theoretical understanding of the principles involved. Standing up to bullies in a controlled environment like Marcus's gym was very different from confronting them in the complex social ecosystem of high school. Over the following days, Dallas continued to show Sloan small kindnesses that helped her navigate the increasingly hostile environment of Jefferson High. He would save her a seat in the classes they shared, positioning himself in a way that created a buffer between her and potential tormentors. He offered to be her partner for group projects, ensuring that she wouldn't have to endure the humiliation of being the last person chosen or being forced to work alone. Their friendship developed organically around shared academic interests and similar approaches to learning. Both were serious students who found genuine fascination in their coursework, and their study sessions in the library became a highlight of Sloan's increasingly difficult days. The library itself was a sanctuary within the school, its quiet atmosphere and scattered tables providing opportunities for genuine conversation away from the performance aspects of hallway interactions. "You're really good at this," Dallas observed one afternoon as they worked together on a joint project for their American history class, comparing their research on the Industrial Revolution's impact on American society. His comment referred to her ability to synthesize complex information from multiple sources and present it in a coherent narrative. Sloan looked up from her carefully organized notes, feeling a flush of pride at the recognition of her academic abilities. "My uncle always told me that understanding how things work gives you power over them," she replied, then immediately worried that the comment revealed too much about her family background and personal philosophy. But Dallas nodded with understanding rather than curiosity, suggesting that he recognized the wisdom behind the observation without needing detailed explanations. "That's a smart way to look at it," he said. "Knowledge really is power, especially when you're dealing with people who want to keep you powerless." His response suggested an intuitive understanding of the dynamics that governed their shared experience at Jefferson High, and it marked the beginning of deeper conversations about the nature of power, the mechanics of social hierarchies, and the strategies that individuals could use to maintain their integrity in hostile environments. Unfortunately, their growing friendship only seemed to intensify the attention from Bryce, Madison, and Tanner, who appeared to interpret any sign of happiness or connection in Sloan's life as a personal affront that required correction. The pattern of harassment that had been established during her first weeks at Jefferson High escalated in both frequency and sophistication, as if her tormentors had decided that mere humiliation was no longer sufficient. The incidents began to follow a more systematic approach, suggesting a level of planning and coordination that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Bryce and his friends seemed to have studied her schedule and routines, timing their attacks for maximum impact and minimum risk of adult intervention. In the cafeteria, they would accidentally bump into her while she was carrying her lunch tray, sending her carefully selected meal crashing to the floor in a spectacular display that invariably drew the attention of nearby students. The crashes were loud enough to silence conversations at surrounding tables, and the resulting mess created a public spectacle that reinforced her position as someone who couldn't even accomplish basic tasks without creating problems. The first time it happened, Sloan had assumed it was genuinely accidental. The cafeteria was crowded, people bumped into each other, and teenage coordination wasn't always reliable. But the pattern quickly became apparent as Tanner would position himself in her path with the kind of timing that suggested careful observation of her movements. The cafeteria workers, who had to clean up the resulting messes, began to regard her with obvious irritation that added another layer of humiliation to the experience. Mrs. Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman who had worked at Jefferson High for over a decade, would sigh heavily and shake her head whenever she saw Sloan approaching the cleanup station, creating the impression that she was a chronic problem rather than a victim of systematic harassment. The spilled food represented more than just wasted money from her limited lunch budget. It symbolized her inability to maintain control over even the most basic aspects of her daily routine. Each incident reinforced the message that she existed at the mercy of those who possessed the power to disrupt her life at will, and that resistance was not only futile, but likely to make her situation worse. They left cruel notes in her locker with a frequency that suggested they had somehow obtained her combination or discovered a way to manipulate the lock mechanism. The notes themselves were carefully crafted to avoid explicit threats that might attract administrative attention, instead focusing on psychological warfare designed to erode her self-confidence and sense of belonging. "Nobody wants you here," read one note, written in Madison's distinctive handwriting with letters that were too perfect to be accidental. "Why don't you just transfer to a school where you might actually fit in?" Another note, apparently composed by Tanner based on its simplified vocabulary and crude humor, suggested physical modifications that might make her more acceptable to her classmates. Maybe if you ate more food instead of wearing it, people might actually notice you exist. The notes were always placed in locations where she would discover them at moments of maximum vulnerability, just before important tests, when she was already stressed about academic performance, or right before classes where she would be required to participate in group activities or public presentations. Madison's social media campaign represented the most sophisticated aspect of their harassment strategy, demonstrating a level of technological savvy and strategic thinking that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so malicious. She had apparently been taking unflattering photos of Sloan without her knowledge, capturing moments of vulnerability or awkwardness that could be taken out of context and presented as evidence of various character flaws. The photos were carefully edited and cropped to maximize their impact, then posted to Madison's Instagram account with captions that mocked everything from Sloan's clothing choices to her apparent lack of social skills. The posts garnered dozens of likes and comments from Jefferson High students who either genuinely found them entertaining or felt pressured to participate in the digital mob in order to maintain their own social standing. "Found this creature wandering the halls today," read one caption beneath a photo that had captured Sloan mid-stumble after Tanner had deliberately bumped into her. "Is there a wildlife preserve where it belongs?" The comments that followed were a mixture of cruel humor and performative cruelty, as students competed to demonstrate their wit and social awareness by adding their own observations about Sloan's appearance, behavior, or general worthiness to exist in their shared space. But the worst incidents occurred in the gymnasium during their shared physical education class, where Coach Williams presided over an environment that seemed specifically designed to maximize opportunities for accidental violence and humiliation. The coach himself was a former college basketball player who had never quite achieved his professional dreams and seemed to harbor resentment toward any student who didn't display natural athletic ability or aggressive competitiveness. Coach Williams stood 6'6" with the kind of imposing physical presence that had once intimidated opposing players on basketball courts across the region. His coaching philosophy appeared to be based on the assumption that physical education should serve as preparation for life's inevitable conflicts, and he consistently turned a blind eye to the kind of aggressive behavior that would have been considered assault in any other context. During volleyball games, Bryce would position himself strategically near the net, waiting for opportunities to spike the ball directly at Sloan's face with a force that went far beyond what was necessary for normal gameplay. The attacks were technically within the rules of volleyball, making it difficult for anyone to object without seeming overly sensitive or unable to handle normal athletic competition. The first time it happened, the impact of the ball against her face had been so unexpected and painful that she had staggered backward and nearly fallen, drawing laughter from her classmates and a sarcastic comment from Coach Williams about paying attention to the game. The physical pain had been significant, a bloody nose and a headache that lasted for hours, but the psychological impact had been even worse. Basketball drills provided even more opportunities for accidental contact, as Madison would position herself to deliver strategic elbows to Sloan's ribs with enough force to leave bruises that would last for days. The attacks were always executed during moments of apparent competitive intensity, making them appear to be natural consequences of aggressive play rather than deliberate attempts to cause injury. Maybe you should stick to activities more suited to your skill level, Madison suggested loudly after Sloan missed an easy layup, her words drawing snickers from nearby classmates who seemed eager to participate in the entertainment. "I hear the chess club is looking for members." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of false helpfulness that made it impossible to respond to directly without seeming ungrateful or oversensitive. It positioned Madison as someone trying to be constructive, while simultaneously reinforcing Sloan's position as someone who didn't belong in normal athletic activities. The chess club comment was particularly pointed because it played into stereotypes about academic students being physically weak and socially awkward, reinforcing the artificial division between intellectual and athletic pursuits that governed much of Jefferson High's social structure. It suggested that Sloan should accept her designated role as a social outcast and stop attempting to participate in activities reserved for more popular students. Coach Williams's response to these incidents was consistently disappointing, ranging from complete obliviousness to active encouragement of the aggressive behavior. When Sloan had attempted to report the deliberately targeted attacks during volleyball, he had dismissed her concerns with a lecture about the importance of toughness and competitive spirit in athletics. "This is physical education, Miss Garrett," he had said, emphasizing her last name in a way that suggested he found her complaint personally irritating. "If you can't handle a little contact, maybe you should consider switching to study hall during this period." His suggestion that she should remove herself from the class rather than expecting her classmates to follow basic rules of sportsmanship sent a clear message about where his sympathies lay. It reinforced the idea that victims were responsible for avoiding abuse rather than perpetrators being responsible for controlling their behavior. Through it all, Dallas continued to provide emotional support and practical assistance that made the increasingly difficult situation bearable. Their friendship had deepened through shared adversity, and Sloan found herself looking forward to their conversations with an intensity that sometimes surprised her. "You don't have to keep defending me," Sloan told him one afternoon as they sat together in the library, working on a joint project for their American history class. The library had become their unofficial headquarters, its quiet atmosphere and scattered tables providing opportunities for genuine conversation away from the surveillance and interference of their tormentors. "I don't want them to make your life miserable too." The concern in her voice reflected a growing awareness that her presence in Dallas's life had made him a target for the same kind of harassment she endured daily. She had witnessed Madison making snide comments about his choice of friends, and Bryce had begun to include him in the verbal abuse that accompanied their hallway encounters. Dallas looked up from his research notes, his expression serious and thoughtful in the way that characterized his approach to most important conversations. "They already tried that, remember? Besides, someone needs to stand up to them. They can't keep treating people like this just because they think they're untouchable." His words resonated with something deep inside Sloan, reminding her of the lessons her uncle had taught her about courage and standing up for what was right. But every time she considered fighting back, really fighting back, using the skills that 6 years of intensive training had given her, she heard Marcus's voice warning her about the responsibility that came with her knowledge and abilities. "Your hands are weapons now," he had told her during one of their last sessions together, his weathered face serious as he emphasized the weight of what he was teaching her. "Use them wisely, and only when you have absolutely no other choice. The moment you cross that line, everything changes. You become responsible for every consequence that follows." The warning had seemed abstract at the time, delivered in the controlled environment of the gym where violence was choreographed and contained within specific rules and expectations. But now, faced with daily humiliation and the growing threat to someone she cared about, the temptation to respond with the decisive action that could end her problems was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. Marcus had taught her that true martial artists were distinguished not by their willingness to fight, but by their ability to avoid fights through a combination of awareness, de-escalation, and strategic withdrawal. The physical techniques were only the final option in a hierarchy of responses that prioritized prevention over confrontation. But the philosophy of avoidance and de-escalation seemed inadequate when faced with opponents who interpreted restraint as weakness and who escalated their attacks in response to any sign of vulnerability. Bryce, Madison, and Tanner appeared to operate according to a different set of rules entirely, where dominance was established through the systematic destruction of anyone who couldn't defend themselves. The internal conflict between her training and her circumstances created a constant tension that manifested in sleepless nights and growing anxiety about each school day. She found herself visualizing responses to their attacks, picturing the precise combinations of strikes and throws that would end their harassment permanently, while simultaneously hearing Marcus's voice, reminding her about the difference between warriors and bullies. The strongest fighters, he had always told her, are the ones who never have to prove it. But what happened when not proving it meant allowing innocent people to be hurt? What happened when restraint enabled cruelty and silence encouraged oppression? The questions haunted her as she watched Dallas endure increasing harassment because of his association with her, and she began to wonder if her uncle's philosophy was adequate for the complex realities of high school social warfare. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October, when the autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the trees surrounding Jefferson High had transformed into a tapestry of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful enough to lift anyone's spirits. Sloan had been looking forward to the weekend with unusual anticipation, having made plans to spend Saturday with Dallas at the local farmers market, where they intended to research local agriculture for their American history project, while enjoying the kind of simple pleasure that had become increasingly rare in their daily lives. The farmers' market had become a symbol of normalcy in her mind, representing the possibility of spending time with someone she cared about without the constant surveillance and interference that characterized their school-based interactions. They had discovered a shared appreciation for the simple ritual of examining fresh produce, talking to local vendors, and observing the kind of community connections that seemed to exist outside the artificial hierarchies that governed teenage social life. She was walking toward the bus stop, her canvas backpack slung over one shoulder and her mind already focused on the weekend's possibilities, when she heard raised voices near the student parking area. The tone was aggressive and threatening in a way that immediately triggered the situational awareness that Marcus had trained into her, causing her to alter her path to investigate what was happening. "I said, give me your wallet, newspaper boy," Bryce's voice carried across the asphalt with the kind of casual cruelty that had become his trademark. The words were accompanied by the sound of someone being shoved against a car with enough force to create a hollow metallic impact that echoed between the rows of vehicles. Sloan's blood ran cold as she saw Dallas pressed against the side of Bryce's truck, the larger boy's hand fisted in his shirt, while Madison and Tanner flanked them like vultures circling wounded prey. The truck itself was a massive F-150 that Bryce's parents had purchased for his 16th birthday, painted in a deep blue that matched Jefferson High's school colors and equipped with enough modifications to ensure it dominated any parking lot where it appeared. Dallas's backpack lay on the ground several feet away, its contents scattered across the pavement in a pattern that suggested it had been thrown rather than dropped. Among the scattered items, Sloan could see his laptop computer, a relatively expensive device that represented months of savings from his part-time job at the local bookstore, lying dangerously close to the truck's massive tires. The laptop was more than just an expensive electronic device. It contained all of Dallas's work for the school newspaper, including articles he had been researching for weeks and interviews with students and faculty that would be impossible to recreate. The loss of that information would represent not just financial damage, but the destruction of work that mattered to him on a personal and professional level. "I don't have any cash," Dallas said, trying to maintain his composure despite the obvious threat to his physical safety. His voice carried the kind of strained calm that suggested he was working hard to avoid escalating the situation through his own actions. "I told you, I don't carry money." The response was both truthful and strategically sound, acknowledging the demand while explaining why he couldn't comply, demonstrating cooperation without submission. It was the kind of careful verbal navigation that Dallas had perfected through his debate experience, where choosing the right words could mean the difference between victory and defeat. But Bryce and his companions weren't interested in reasonable explanations or logical solutions. They were interested in power and dominance, in the kind of public humiliation that would reinforce their position in the school's social hierarchy, while sending a clear message to anyone who might consider challenging their authority. "Then maybe we need to teach you about proper preparation," Madison said with a cruel smile that didn't reach her eyes, pulling out her phone to record the confrontation with the kind of practiced ease that suggested she had done this before. "This is going to be perfect for my social media followers. Local nerd gets reality check." The phone was the latest iPhone model, protected by a case that probably cost more than most students' monthly allowances, and Madison held it with the confidence of someone who had built her social media presence through careful documentation of other people's misfortunes. Her followers had come to expect regular content that showcased her superiority over less fortunate classmates, and Dallas's humiliation would provide exactly the kind of entertainment they craved. The implications of being recorded were particularly troubling because they transformed a private assault into public entertainment that would be preserved and shared indefinitely. Dallas understood, as Sloan did, that any weakness or fear he displayed would be captured and distributed throughout Jefferson High's social networks, becoming part of his permanent reputation within the school's complex social ecosystem. Tanner grabbed Dallas's laptop from the ground with his massive hands, holding it high above his head with the kind of theatrical gesture that suggested he was performing for Madison's camera. "Wonder if this thing can fly," he mused with the kind of crude humor that passed for wit in their social circle, clearly intending to smash the expensive device against the pavement. The threat was both practical and symbolic, destroying something that Dallas valued while demonstrating the group's power to cause damage without consequences. The laptop represented not just money, but connection to the outside world, academic achievement, and future opportunities, making its destruction particularly meaningful as an act of psychological warfare. That's when Sloan saw red. The sight of Dallas being terrorized because of his friendship with her triggered something primal and protective inside her chest that overrode every lesson about restraint and responsibility that Marcus had taught her. All of her uncle's warnings about control and discipline seemed to evaporate in the face of watching someone she cared about being hurt by the same people who had made her life miserable for months. The transformation that occurred in that moment was both physical and psychological, as years of suppressed anger and frustration crystallized into a cold, focused determination that felt like flipping a switch inside her mind. The scared, defensive girl who had been trying to remain invisible disappeared, replaced by someone who had spent 6 years learning how to handle exactly this kind of situation. Without conscious thought, Sloan dropped her backpack to the asphalt and strode across the parking lot with purposeful steps, her posture changing with each stride. Gone was the hunched, defensive stance she had maintained for months at Jefferson High. Instead, she moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting her technique, her center of gravity low and balanced, her hands relaxed but ready. The change in her body language was dramatic enough to catch the attention of the few students who were still in the parking lot, preparing to leave for the weekend. Those who noticed her approach saw something they had never seen before. Sloan Garrett, moving like a predator rather than prey, with the kind of controlled aggression that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing and was prepared to do it. "Let him go," she said, her voice carrying a steel edge that none of them had ever heard before. The words emerged from somewhere deep in her chest, carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty about one's capabilities and intentions. It was the voice of someone who had moved beyond fear and negotiation into the realm of direct action, and it cut through the afternoon air with the precision of a blade. The three bullies turned toward her with expressions of disbelief and amusement that suggested they found the idea of Sloan challenging them too entertaining to take seriously. Bryce released his grip on Dallas's shirt, apparently finding the prospect of humiliating both of his victims simultaneously too appealing to ignore. "Or what, Oregon?" he laughed, puffing out his chest and taking a step toward her with the kind of swaggering confidence that had served him well throughout his high school career. "You going to bore us to death with one of your sad little sob stories?" The laugh was loud and theatrical, designed to draw attention from any remaining students in the parking lot while reinforcing his position as the dominant figure in the confrontation. But there was something slightly forced about it, a quality that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the change in Sloan's demeanor, even if he couldn't quite identify what was different. "Yeah," Madison chimed in, her phone still recording as she tried to capture every moment of what she assumed would be Sloan's final humiliation. "This is even better. The mouse thinks she's a lion." The metaphor was more accurate than Madison realized, though not in the way she intended. Sloan had indeed transformed from something small and defensive into something powerful and dangerous, but the change wasn't a delusion of grandeur. It was the emergence of capabilities that had been deliberately hidden for months. Sloan noticed the small crowd of students that had begun to gather around the edges of the parking lot, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of entertainment that had become a regular feature of Jefferson High's social landscape. Their phones were already out and recording, documenting what they assumed would be another routine humiliation that would provide content for their social media feeds. She saw Dallas shake his head slightly, his expression showing concern about what might happen if she escalated the situation beyond the verbal confrontation that had defined most of their previous encounters. His eyes held a mixture of gratitude for her intervention and worry about the potential consequences of challenging three people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. But she also saw the bruise forming on his cheek where Bryce had struck him, and the fear in his eyes that came from being physically overpowered by someone larger and stronger. The sight of his pain and vulnerability triggered something protective and fierce inside her that overwhelmed every consideration of consequences or strategic restraint. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Sloan said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable threat that seemed to lower the temperature of the immediate area. "Let him go and walk away." The words were delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone within hearing distance pay attention, creating a moment of silence that felt pregnant with possibility. It was the last opportunity for de-escalation, the final chance for reason to prevail over violence, and everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing a critical moment that would determine how the confrontation resolved. Bryce's laughter grew louder and more mocking, but there was an edge of nervousness that hadn't been present before, as if some part of his mind was registering the change in Sloan's demeanor and warning him that the situation might not unfold as predictably as he expected. "You know what?" he said, his voice carrying a mixture of amusement and genuine irritation. "I think Oregon needs to learn her place once and for all." With those words, he lunged forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that had intimidated dozens of opponents on football fields throughout his high school career, clearly intending to grab Sloan the same way he had grabbed Dallas and demonstrate his physical dominance through sheer size and strength. What happened next unfolded so quickly that most of the watching students barely registered the individual movements, their phones capturing a blur of motion that would require slow-motion replay to fully comprehend. The confrontation that they had expected to be a brief and one-sided demonstration of Bryce's physical superiority transformed into something entirely different. A masterclass in the application of technique, leverage, and years of disciplined training. As Bryce reached for her with hands that had been confident in their ability to overpower any resistance, Sloan stepped to the side with liquid grace that made his lunge look clumsy and telegraphed by comparison. Her movement was economical and precise, covering just enough distance to avoid his grasp, while positioning herself for the counterattack that followed with mathematical inevitability. She caught his outstretched arm with both hands, her fingers finding the pressure points that Marcus had taught her to locate with pinpoint accuracy, and used his own momentum against him in a demonstration of the fundamental principle that had governed her martial arts training. The larger and stronger an opponent was, the more devastating their own force became when redirected properly. The hip throw that followed was executed with textbook perfection, a technique that she had practiced thousands of times in the controlled environment of Tiger's Den gym, but had never applied with the kind of intent that now drove her actions. Bryce's 200 pounds of muscle and bone became a projectile that traced an arc through the afternoon air before crashing onto the asphalt with a bone-jarring impact that could be heard throughout the parking lot. The sound of his body hitting the pavement was sickeningly loud, a combination of flesh meeting concrete and air being forcibly expelled from his lungs that created an auditory punctuation mark for the end of his athletic confidence. The impact sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd, transforming their expectation of easy entertainment into something more serious and potentially dangerous. The parking lot fell silent, except for Bryce's groaning as he struggled to understand what had just happened to him. The cocky smile that had been a permanent fixture of his facial expression had vanished completely, replaced by shock and the beginnings of genuine fear as he tried to reconcile his assumptions about Sloan's capabilities with the reality of finding himself flat on his back, gasping for air. The silence stretched for several seconds as everyone present tried to process what they had witnessed. Bryce Kellerman, the star quarterback who had dominated Jefferson High's athletic and social landscape for 3 years, had been taken down by someone half his size, who moved with the kind of professional competence that suggested extensive training and real capability. Tanner, seeing his leader on the ground and apparently feeling obligated to restore the group's dominance through his own physical intervention, dropped Dallas's laptop and charged forward like an enraged bull. His approach was characterized by the kind of straight-line aggression that worked well against opponents who were intimidated by size and strength, but which left him vulnerable to anyone who understood the principles of timing and misdirection. But Sloan was ready for him, her training having prepared her for exactly this kind of sequential assault, where multiple opponents attacked in predictable patterns rather than coordinating their efforts effectively. As Tanner reached for her with arms that could have crushed her in a bear hug, she ducked under his clumsy grab with the fluid grace of a dancer and drove her knee upward into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The technique was one that Marcus had emphasized during their training sessions, explaining that the solar plexus represented a target that could incapacitate even large opponents without causing permanent damage. The cluster of nerves located just below the sternum, when struck with proper technique and timing, would temporarily disrupt the body's ability to control breathing and movement. The impact of her knee against Tanner's solar plexus was delivered with all the force that 6 years of conditioning had built into her legs, multiplied by the upward momentum of her entire body. The result was immediate and devastating. Tanner doubled over as if he had been struck by a sledgehammer, all the air rushing out of his lungs in a whoosh that could be heard across the parking lot. His massive frame, which had seemed so imposing when he was using it to intimidate smaller students, became a liability as he struggled to remain upright while his body's autonomic systems worked to restore normal breathing patterns. The sight of someone so large being incapacitated so quickly and completely sent ripples of shock through the watching crowd. Madison, realizing that her entertainment had turned into something far more serious than she had anticipated, tried to back away while still recording with her phone. Her earlier confidence had evaporated as she watched both of her companions neutralized with an efficiency that suggested their opponent possessed capabilities they had never suspected. But Sloan's attention was already focused on her, and the girl found herself trapped between parked cars with nowhere to run. The physical geography of the parking lot, which had seemed like an ideal location for public humiliation, had become a cage that prevented easy escape. "Please," Madison stammered, her earlier bravado completely evaporated and replaced by the kind of fear she had spent months inflicting on others. "I was just recording. I didn't do anything." The words came out in a rush, as if she could somehow distance herself from the harassment campaign she had orchestrated by claiming passive rather than active participation. But her protest revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of responsibility and complicity that Sloan found more irritating than convincing. "You did plenty," Sloan replied, her voice still carrying the eerily calm tone that had characterized her throughout the confrontation. "You've been doing plenty for months." The statement was delivered without emotion or drama, but it carried the weight of accumulated pain and frustration that months of systematic harassment had created. It acknowledged the psychological warfare that Madison had waged through social media, the carefully orchestrated humiliation campaigns, and the cruel pleasure she had taken in documenting other people's suffering. Instead of violence, however, Sloan simply plucked the phone from Madison's trembling hands and accessed the video she had been recording. The device felt expensive and fragile in her fingers, representing the technological tools that Madison had weaponized against her classmates for entertainment and social positioning. With deliberate precision, she deleted the video that would have provided entertainment for Madison's followers, while preserving a record of violence that could have complicated the aftermath of the confrontation. The action was both practical and symbolic, removing the evidence that could be used against her while demonstrating that the power dynamic had shifted permanently. She handed the device back without a word, but the message was clear. The reign of terror that had defined their relationship was over, and any future interactions would occur on very different terms. Madison's influence had been built on her ability to document and distribute the humiliation of others, and that capability had just been neutralized. Bryce had managed to struggle back to his feet during the exchange, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage as he tried to process the destruction of his carefully constructed reputation. The fall had torn his letter jacket and scraped his palms, but more importantly, it had shattered his assumption of physical invincibility that had anchored his social dominance. "You psycho freak," he screamed, launching himself at Sloan with wild, uncontrolled swings that bore no resemblance to the disciplined aggression that had made him successful on the football field. His attack was driven by emotion rather than strategy, characterized by the kind of desperate fury that emerges when someone's fundamental assumptions about reality are suddenly challenged. The careful coordination and tactical thinking that made him an effective quarterback had been replaced by berserker rage that made him predictable and vulnerable. This time, Sloan didn't hold back or limit herself to defensive techniques. She weaved between his punches with the fluid movements of a trained fighter, her body moving like water around his clumsy attacks. Her evasion wasn't desperate or panicked. It was methodical and controlled, allowing his energy to exhaust itself while she waited for the optimal moment to counterattack. Marcus had taught her that the most effective fighters were those who could remain calm and analytical even in the midst of violent confrontation, using their opponent's emotional instability as a tactical advantage. Bryce's rage was making him sloppy and predictable, telegraphing his intentions through his body language and creating openings that a more disciplined fighter could exploit. When she saw her opening, a moment when Bryce overextended himself in an attempt to land a haymaker that would have been devastating if it had connected, she struck with lightning speed. Her right cross was a perfect demonstration of the technique that Marcus had drilled into her through countless hours of practice, utilizing the rotation of her entire body to generate force rather than relying solely on arm strength. The punch connected with Bryce's jaw with a sharp crack that echoed across the parking lot, the sound carrying the authority of proper technique and precise timing. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his coordination disrupted and his confidence shattered as he struggled to remain upright. But it was her follow-up that truly demonstrated the level of skill she had achieved through years of dedicated training. As Bryce tried to regain his balance, his hands instinctively moving to protect his injured jaw, Sloan pivoted with the grace of a ballet dancer and delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to his midsection. The kick was a masterpiece of biomechanical efficiency, utilizing the large muscles of her legs and hips to generate force while maintaining perfect balance and control. Her shin connected with Bryce's solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet, the impact creating a hollow sound that suggested significant trauma to his internal organs. The force of the blow sent him crashing into the side of his own truck with enough momentum to leave a visible dent in the metal, the expensive vehicle becoming an unwilling participant in his humiliation. Bryce slumped to the ground beside his damaged truck, clutching his ribs and gasping for air as his body struggled to cope with the systematic beating he had received. The crowd of students watched in stunned silence as Sloan stood over her defeated tormentors, her breathing steady and controlled despite the physical exertion she had just completed. Her posture remained relaxed and balanced, suggesting that the confrontation had required effort but hadn't pushed her to her limits. The transformation in her appearance was striking. Gone was the hunched, defensive girl who had tried to remain invisible in Jefferson High's hallways, replaced by someone who radiated confidence and competence. Her eyes held the kind of calm alertness that Marcus had taught her to maintain, ready to respond to any additional threats while remaining aware of her surroundings and the reactions of potential witnesses. She looked down at Bryce, who was struggling to catch his breath while his carefully constructed image of invincibility lay in ruins around him. For a moment, everyone present expected her to deliver a final, devastating blow that would complete his humiliation and establish her dominance through overwhelming force. Instead, in a gesture that demonstrated the character that Marcus had spent years cultivating alongside her physical skills, she stepped back and extended her hand to help him up. The offer of assistance to someone who had tormented her for months showed a level of maturity and self-control that impressed even those witnesses who didn't fully understand the martial arts philosophy that informed her actions. "It's over," she said simply, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone present pay attention. "It doesn't have to happen again." The words offered a path forward that didn't require continued violence or escalating retaliation, acknowledging that the point had been made without demanding complete surrender or ongoing submission. It was the offer of someone who had proven her capabilities but preferred to achieve resolution through restraint rather than dominance. Bryce stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, his pride warring with the obvious reality of his situation and the physical pain that reminded him of her capabilities. The gesture forced him to confront the choice between continuing a conflict he couldn't win or accepting a resolution that preserved some measure of his dignity. Finally, swallowing his ego and acknowledging the shift in power that had occurred, he accepted her help and struggled to his feet with movements that suggested significant soreness and bruising. The action required him to place his physical safety in the hands of someone he had been tormenting, creating a moment of vulnerability that completed his psychological defeat. "How?" he asked, genuine confusion replacing the arrogance that had characterized his earlier behavior. "How did you do that?" The question was asked without malice or sarcasm, reflecting a sincere desire to understand how his assumptions about physical dominance and social hierarchy had been so thoroughly overturned by someone he had dismissed as weak and irrelevant. 6 years of training," Sloan replied matter-of-factly, her tone carrying neither boastfulness nor false modesty. "My uncle thought I should know how to protect myself." The explanation was simple and direct, acknowledging the source of her capabilities without revealing the philosophical framework that had guided their development. It suggested years of disciplined effort rather than natural talent or lucky circumstances, implying that her actions had been the result of preparation rather than impulse. The gathering crowd began to disperse as teachers started arriving, drawn by reports of a fight in the parking lot that had reached the administrative offices through the school's informal communication networks. But the damage to the Bullies' reputation had already been done, their dominance shattered in front of witnesses who would ensure that the story spread throughout Jefferson High's social networks. Videos of the confrontation, taken by multiple witnesses from different angles, were already circulating through the school's social media platforms with the viral intensity that characterized teenage information sharing. By Monday morning, everyone at Jefferson High would know that the quiet girl from Oregon had single-handedly defeated 3 of the school's most feared students with a display of skill and restraint that would become legendary. Coach Williams arrived just as the crowd was breaking up, his expression stern as he surveyed the scene and tried to piece together what had happened from the scattered evidence and conflicting witness accounts. The aftermath of the confrontation, 3 injured students, a damaged truck, and a gathering crowd with phones, suggested something more serious than the typical teenage disagreements he was accustomed to handling. "What happened here?" he demanded, looking between Sloan and the 3 students who were clearly nursing injuries that went beyond normal athletic wear and tear. His question was directed primarily at Bryce, whose status as star quarterback made him the most important figure in any equation that involved potential disciplinary action or administrative consequences. The coach's priorities were clearly influenced by his investment in the football team's success and his concern about losing key players to suspension or other administrative sanctions. "Just a misunderstanding, Coach," Dallas said quickly, having retrieved his laptop and confirmed that it was undamaged despite its rough treatment. His intervention was strategic, designed to prevent the situation from escalating into official disciplinary proceedings that could complicate everyone's lives. "Everything's been resolved." His response reflected both gratitude for Sloan's intervention and awareness that involving school administration in the aftermath could create complications that might ultimately work against their interests. The unwritten rules of teenage social dynamics often favored unofficial resolution over formal justice, particularly when the victims had achieved decisive victory. Bryce nodded reluctantly, apparently deciding that admitting he had been beaten by Sloan would be even more humiliating than staying silent about the confrontation. His pride had already taken enough damage, and involving adults would only ensure that his defeat became part of his official school record rather than just teenage gossip. "Yeah, it's fine," he said through gritted teeth, his words carrying the strain of someone trying to maintain dignity while acknowledging defeat. "Just an accident." The lie was transparent to everyone present, but it served the interests of all parties by avoiding the complex administrative processes that would have followed an official report of violence on school property. Coach Williams, recognizing the precarious nature of the situation and his own limited understanding of what had actually occurred, accepted the explanation with obvious relief. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere at Jefferson High underwent a dramatic transformation that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the parking lot confrontation. Word of Sloan's hidden skills spread through the student body like wildfire, carried by social media posts, eyewitness accounts, and the inevitable embellishments that accompanied any story involving dramatic reversals of established social hierarchies. The videos that had been captured during the confrontation became the subject of intense analysis and discussion, with students examining the footage frame by frame to understand exactly how someone they had dismissed as weak and irrelevant had managed to defeat 3 opponents with such devastating efficiency. The recordings showed techniques that were clearly the result of extensive training, suggesting capabilities that went far beyond lucky circumstances or adrenaline-fueled desperation. But instead of fear, which Sloan had worried might be the primary response to her display of violence, she found herself gaining respect and admiration from classmates who had previously ignored her existence. Students who had maintained careful neutrality in the school's social conflicts began to nod respectfully when she passed in the hallways, their acknowledgement suggesting a fundamental shift in her position within Jefferson High's complex hierarchy. The respect wasn't based on intimidation or the threat of violence. It was recognition of someone who had demonstrated the courage to stand up against injustice and the character to show restraint even in the midst of justified anger. Her decision to help Bryce up after defeating him had been noted and discussed, creating a narrative that portrayed her as someone who fought for protection rather than dominance. Others approached her with stories of their own bullying experiences, finding courage in her example and hope in the demonstration that victims weren't powerless against their tormentors. These conversations, often conducted in quiet corners of the library or during brief encounters between classes, revealed the extent to which harassment and intimidation had shaped the daily experience of many Jefferson High students. "I never thought anyone would actually fight back," confided Sarah Martinez, a sophomore who had been dealing with harassment from a group of older girls who had targeted her for her academic success and perceived social awkwardness. "Seeing what you did made me realize that maybe I don't have to just accept it." The conversations weren't always comfortable, as they forced Sloan to confront the reality that her actions had implications beyond her own situation. Students began to see her as a symbol of resistance against the systematic cruelty that characterized much of their shared experience, creating expectations and responsibilities that she hadn't anticipated. Marcus had warned her about this aspect of martial arts training, that visible competence created obligations to those who couldn't protect themselves, and that true strength often meant accepting burdens that others couldn't bear. The lesson had seemed abstract during their philosophical discussions in the gym's quiet office, but now it took on immediate practical significance. Bryce, Madison, and Tanner maintained a careful distance from both Sloan and Dallas, their once dominant presence in the school's social hierarchy significantly diminished by the public nature of their defeat. The videos of their humiliation had become something of a legend among the student body, proof that even the most powerful bullies could be brought low by someone they had underestimated. The change in their behavior was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who had been paying attention to Jefferson High's social dynamics. Bryce's swagger had been replaced by a more cautious demeanor, particularly when navigating areas where he might encounter Sloan or her growing circle of supporters. His letter jacket, once worn like armor that proclaimed his invincibility, now seemed more like a costume that reminded everyone of capabilities he could no longer claim with confidence. Madison's social media presence, which had been built on documenting the humiliation of others, shifted towards safer content that didn't risk provoking someone who had demonstrated both the ability and willingness to respond to harassment with decisive action. Her follower count remained high, but the engagement on her posts suggested that her audience was beginning to lose interest in content that no longer carried the edge of cruelty that had made it compelling. Tanner, whose role had always been primarily as muscle for the group's operations, seemed most affected by the realization that size and strength weren't guarantees of dominance. His intimidation tactics, which had relied on the assumption that his physical presence would be enough to cow potential victims, lost their effectiveness once word spread about how easily he had been neutralized. The most significant change, however, was in Sloan herself. Gone was the hunched, defensive posture she had maintained for months, replaced by the kind of confident bearing that reflected her true capabilities and character. She walked with her head held high, her movements reflecting the inner strength she had finally allowed herself to embrace. The oversized hoodies that had been designed to conceal her physical condition were replaced by clothes that actually fit, revealing the lean muscle definition that years of training had created. She no longer felt the need to hide behind her hair or avoid eye contact, having discovered that visibility wasn't necessarily dangerous when backed by genuine capability. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological and social, reflecting a fundamental shift in how she understood her place in the world and her responsibility to others. The scared, defensive girl who had arrived from Oregon had been replaced by someone who understood the true meaning of strength and was prepared to use it wisely. "You know," Dallas said one afternoon, as they sat together in their favorite corner of the library, working on a collaborative article for the school newspaper about the social dynamics that govern teenage life, "I always suspected there was more to you than met the eye." His comment was delivered with the kind of warm appreciation that had become characteristic of their friendship, acknowledging the journey she had undertaken while expressing gratitude for the person she had become. Their relationship had deepened through shared adversity and mutual respect, creating the kind of connection that transcended the superficial considerations that governed most high school social interactions. Sloan smiled, feeling more at peace than she had since arriving at Jefferson and experiencing the first genuine happiness she had known since leaving Portland. "My uncle always said that true strength isn't about hurting people, it's about protecting those who can't protect themselves." The words carried the weight of Marcus's teachings and her own hard-won understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. The philosophy that had once seemed abstract and idealistic had been tested in the crucible of real conflict and emerged validated by experience. "Wise man," Dallas replied, reaching over to take her hand with the kind of gentle affection that had become natural between them. "I'm glad you finally decided to listen to him." The gesture was simple but meaningful, representing the trust and connection that had grown between them through shared challenges and mutual support. Their friendship had evolved into something deeper and more significant, built on shared values and genuine understanding rather than convenience or social positioning. 3 months later, as spring transformed Jefferson High's campus into a tapestry of green lawns and blooming trees, Sloan found herself walking across the stage in the school's auditorium to receive recognition for her academic achievements. The ceremony itself was a celebration of students who had demonstrated excellence in various fields, from academic performance to community service to artistic achievement. Her recognition was for maintaining a 4.0 GPA while contributing to the school newspaper and organizing a peer tutoring program that had helped dozens of struggling students improve their academic performance. The tutoring program had grown out of her desire to use her capabilities for constructive purposes, extending the protective philosophy that Marcus had taught her into the academic realm. As she stood at the podium, looking out over the assembled crowd of students, parents, and faculty, she reflected on the lessons she had learned during her challenging first year at Jefferson High. The journey from invisible victim to respected leader had been neither simple nor straightforward, requiring her to confront fundamental questions about the nature of strength, the responsibility that came with capability, and the difference between warriors and bullies. Standing up for herself hadn't turned her into a bully. It had shown her the true meaning of strength and the importance of using power wisely. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the determination to do what was right despite fear, and that true strength was measured not by the ability to destroy, but by the commitment to protect. In the audience, Dallas applauded enthusiastically. His own bruises long healed, but his respect for Sloan stronger than ever. Their relationship had become one of the most positive aspects of her Jefferson High experience, demonstrating that genuine connection was possible even in an environment characterized by superficial competition and social manipulation. Nearby, she could see Bryce sitting with his teammates, and when their eyes met across the auditorium, he offered a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship, perhaps, but it was a grudging respect that hadn't existed before their confrontation in the parking lot. The gesture suggested that he had learned something from their encounter about the true nature of strength and the consequences of using power to hurt rather than protect. Madison sat with her usual group of followers, but her expression showed none of the cruel satisfaction that had once characterized her observation of other students' achievements. The social media campaign that had once made her a feared figure in Jefferson High's digital landscape had evolved into content that focused on her own accomplishments rather than others' failures. As Sloan accepted her award and looked out over the assembled crowd, she finally understood what her uncle had been trying to teach her all along. True strength wasn't about the ability to hurt others. It was about having the courage to stand up when it mattered most, the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy, and the character to remain true to yourself, even when others tried to tear you down. The quiet girl from Oregon had found her voice, discovered her strength, and learned to use both wisely. In the process, she had not only transformed her own life, but had contributed to positive changes in the lives of those around her. Jefferson High would never be the same, and neither would she. The lessons Marcus had taught her in the controlled environment of Tiger's Den Gym had been tested in the complex social laboratory of high school and had emerged validated by experience. She had learned that strength without wisdom was meaningless, that power without compassion was destructive, and that true warriors were distinguished not by their willingness to fight, but by their commitment to justice. As she left the stage, diploma in hand and future bright with possibility, Sloan carried with her the knowledge that she had successfully navigated one of life's most challenging transitions. She had moved from victim to victor while maintaining her essential humanity, from weakness to strength while preserving her capacity for mercy, from isolation to connection while staying true to her fundamental values. The journey had been difficult, sometimes painful, and occasionally dangerous, but it had also been transformative in ways that extended far beyond her individual experience, creating ripple effects that would continue to influence Jefferson High's social culture long after she graduated and moved on to the next phase of her life. The girl who had once hidden behind oversized hoodies and downcast eyes had become a young woman who walked with confidence, spoke with authority, and acted with the kind of moral courage that inspired others to examine their own choices and behavior. The transformation was complete, but the lessons learned would continue to guide her for the rest of her life. In the end, Sloan's story at Jefferson High became more than just a tale of a bullied student fighting back. It became a demonstration of how individual courage could catalyze broader change, how true strength could triumph over artificial power, and how one person's commitment to justice could inspire others to examine their own values and choices. The quiet girl from Oregon had indeed found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs as well.